All right, so let's talk a little bit about design principles. We've discussed already the elements of design, so the elements of art. Those are our building blocks. The principles are the rules that we use to organize the elements. So in your reading, we discussed these a little, or you read a little bit about these: unity, emphasis, balance, rhythm, depth, and color. So depth and form are very similar. We're going to go through them together. I want to show you what it looks like when these are used successfully before you go on to make your own projects. So first things first, there's a rule about how our brains like to process information. This is called Gestalt. So the Gestalt theory says that people need to see pattern and they need to see organization in images. If things are crazy and chaotic, we're not going to pay attention to it, that we don't like to look at this. Look at those things. A lot of people get this feeling when they look at art that is non-representational, also known as by some as abstract art. So things that are intentionally chaotic or have different meanings that are not understood can be challenging to a lot of people because they don't know what they're looking at, they don't get the pattern, and that is a definite issue when it comes to that type of artwork. However, we're going to discuss a little bit later about what the successes of that are and what the challenges of it are. But we're going to start right now with the most basic building blocks. So how do we create excellent compositions? And we're using our design principles to do that. So the first principle I want to talk about is unity. And we can demonstrate unity in a couple different ways: proximity, repetition, continuation, color shade, and intellectual unity. And let's look at how that works. So you learned in your reading assignment, that unity is a feeling of wholeness. And these different characteristics are how we create wholeness. So proximity, repetition, continuation, color, and intellectual unity, these are how we make this feeling of wholeness. Okay, so first one is proximity, and this little icon, set of icons, this little visual, should show you what that feels like. So these guys here feel unified because they're connected. They're all connected together. So they're in proximity with each other. They're close to each other, so they feel like one unit. They are actually separate units. These guys are almost exactly the same, but they're not all together like this one, so they don't feel unified because they're not using proximity. Here's an example. So this is one actually for election day. This was used to get people to vote. Here we go, and it says act your age, and all this functions in this design as one big object, one visual object, because it's unified by proximity. The font helps as well. Okay, so unity by repetition, repeating things to create a unified image. So here for this cover of a Talking Heads album, we have 3 faces with red paint on top of them to create a pattern and repetition. Unity by continuation. You can see in my visual here, we understand this principle or this element of line is creating unity. It's this continuation of an idea or thought. So here's an example. This woman's body is broken into pieces, but the line continues the idea, the set of circles, concentric circles. Unity by color. So all 4 of these objects, and even the type as well, they feel like they all go together because they're unified by a monochromatic color palette. It's a color, one hue throughout the whole thing, but different shades. Example, here's a set of packaging using a monochromatic color palette. Feels very unified visually. Intellectual unity is like a little visual joke. So here we have the fork, the knife, and the plate. We understand that all those things go together. In this advertisement for IBM, we get the visual joke here, IBM. There's not a lot of other types of unity here. We do have the repetition of the stripes that connects them together visually, and this sort of basic shape. They're created from basic shapes, but we get that there's a little joke because we've heard of IBM before. Okay, so a lack of unity. None of these things feel like they go together. It's disjointed. Big problem. This is some fax spam. Hopefully some of you have ever seen this before, or hopefully not, maybe. It would come into a fax machine, and this is actually from the August of 2000, it looks like. And it has no visual unity. It looks very broken apart. Look at how many different fonts we have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm not even going to stop counting. That's way too many. It's so chaotic. It's center aligned, but not in a cohesive way. It's just a big fat mess. So it had lacking unity. This is lacking unity. I want you to think about that if you were to take this same idea, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Some of you might get that we're going to do something like this a little bit later. How would you take this idea for a Bahamas cruise and a stay in Orlando? It's actually kind of an interesting thing to make a poster for, or a fax spam for. Just it can be done in such a cleaner, more beautiful, more unified way where it feels like everything goes together. All I see is this, and this is just a mess, right? What do I want to emphasize? We'll get to that a little later. Ha ha! And there it is. Emphasis, so the most important thing. And how do I draw attention to the most important element? So there's a couple different ways. Again, size, shape, placement, and color, all contrasting them. So to contrast something is to make it look different. So difference in shape, size, placement, and color to bring your attention to something to make it the most important part. Isolation is another way to do it. So put it by itself. If it's separated from the rest of the group, it's going to look more important. It's be emphasized. And position or direction. We'll take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so emphasis by contrast and size. If I was going to say which one of these is most important, it'd be kind of an interesting exercise, but I'm definitely drawing visual attention back and forth between these two. This little guy is visually going to draw my attention over, and then this guy's going to bring it over because it's so big and it has this great diagonal going. Okay, so here we go. Advertisement for some German pottery. Using emphasis. What's the most important thing? The biggest thing. I see this. As a matter of fact, this is even pixelated. We can't even read this. Doesn't even matter. All I want to do is look at this, and then down here. Maybe here, right? This is a little bit because it has a little bit different font, so it's drawing my eye. But we're creating visual unity with the use of a monochromatic color palette again. It's all black. And then we've got this beautiful, large, flat Helvetica with these large, flat, kind of curved shapes. Okay, emphasis by contrast in shape. So where am I going to draw my attention to? Tiny squares, and then the circle. One of these things is not like the other, as they used to say on Sesame Street. For example, here, this is some German throat tablets. Shape. So visual unity, again, the color palette, but this is such a dramatic shape. All of these have very curved lines, and this is very hard in shape. Very cool ad. So contrast in placement. So again, if we're talking about unity by continuation, we have this straight line. We're using that element of line, and then, oops, something is different. Contrast again, it drops out. This guy becomes the most important one. It's not going to be this one. It's going to be this one that's different. It's going to pull my eye back to it over and over and over again. Here we go. So what's the most important element? This one also has a little visual joke, which is absolutely beautifully done. So we've got a contrast in placement. It should be vertical, but we've tipped it sideways. Contrast in color. Exact same set of circles, but my eye is so powerfully drawn to this one, especially because all of this has that monochromatic color palette. Even the type is overridden by this use of color. We're using blue and yellow here. Okay, so here's one. I shop, therefore I am. So using shape, this big, heavy, attention-grabbing red square, rectangle, excuse me, and it just sucks your eye in. Even though this is so much more detailed and we can kind of follow the light around, no one is going to look out here, except for very, very briefly. This is too powerful, this really, really strong shape. Emphasis by isolation, so even around the type, we've got all the little squares, and then this guy is so lonely over here, right? We keep going to go back to it over and over and over again because it's isolated. So here, the minstrel man, mobile ad, little hands here, separated visually, isolated from the rest. We want to fill this space in visually. Emphasis by position and direction. So here was the example that I wanted you to take a look at before we really talked about it. So we're using line again. Got these continuation lines, these dotted lines, and they all point to one spot. So its position is the most important factor. It's being pointed to by all these other elements. It's being emphasized by other elements of art. Here's a great example. Looking at what's being emphasized, this mouth. Great use of color palette here again too. Notice how simple it is. Only 3 colors here. And just great, 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 great use of diagonals and emphasis by position. Extreme emphasis. So this is when we use multiple things. We've made it different. We've made it larger. We're using bright color. We're pointing to it. So emphasis by direction and position. You can add so many things. Please don't go crazy with this one. Balance. There's symmetrical and asymmetrical balance. That was in your reading. Random balance, which is when things kind of look a little bit crazy, but it still works. And then mathematical balance, which is incredibly important in graphic design, which is use of the grid. So symmetrical balance, things that have symmetry, are like a butterfly or an hourglass. They're going to be the same on both sides. So this has vertical symmetrical balance. You can divide it in half vertically. And horizontal symmetrical balance. I can divide it in half this way. And if I fold that paper right along these axes, it's going to be exactly the same on both sides. For example, here. Symmetrical balance. Exactly the same? No, there's a little bit different here because the E is different on this side. However, it totally works. The shadow as well. It feels incredibly balanced. The weight is balanced. So the letters may be different, the sides may be different, but I can actually fold it in half and it feels like it's vertically balanced. Asymmetrical balance. This is when we've got weight on one side and a lot of something else on the other side. So they balance each other out. So this is the larger object. This is the smaller object. It has more visual power because it's type and it's light colored. So it balances this whole idea out. They are not the same thing like symmetrical balance, but they balance each other. An example I love to use is, let's say, a really, really fat kid on one side, right? And then 3 little kids on the side of the teeter-totter. As long as they're the same weight, it totally works. My dad used to do this one all the time to me when I was a kid, and I never got it. I'm going to admit that I didn't get this one forever. He used to say, which weighs more, Holly? A ton of cotton or a ton of steel? And it took me forever. Before I understood it, I'm like, the ton of steel, the ton of steel. The ton of steel may be smaller, in volume than a ton of cotton, but they actually weigh the same. So that's the same principle of asymmetrical balance. Here we've got something that's more neutrally colored, and that's going to be balanced out by something that's more heavy. Right? Something that's brighter draws the attention a little bit more. Also, position plays a factor here. So this one's lifted up a little bit, so it draws our attention again. But this one is large and it's gray. So think of it as something that's very soft. But this is a little bit heavier. It's just a more careful variation of this one. This is very extreme. This is a little bit more gentle. And this one is awkwardness, right? So visual interest plays a factor here. Because this shape is really weird, we want to look at it. We go, what the heck is this? What's going on here? Well, this one is very neutral, and they're still the same color, so we're using that monochromatic color palette. Okay, asymmetrical balance by size. We talked about this already. This is our 3 little kids with 1 fat kid and balancing them out together. So here we go. Very heavy visual element, several small visual elements, balancing it out. Feels unified, feels balanced. Asymmetrical balance by position, so where it's located becomes important. So this is a little bit higher in the frame. It's also smaller. It's emphasized more with this. Look at how great this line is from the edge of this circle to the edge of that circle. It makes almost a triangle pointing at this little guy and bringing our eye over here. Here's an example. So balance by position. This may be smaller, and this is visually heavier, but the line and the direction and just the drama of this image draw us down to this guy over and over and over and over and over again. The yellow helps as well. So we're just pointing everything down at him, so the position becomes very important. So asymmetrical balance by shape. This is our awkward looking item. We keep wanting to look at it. Who cares about this boring rectangle? This thing is way too much fun for my eye. Here again, which one is the awkward one? Well, I think that's probably pretty obvious, I hope. We keep going here, going, oh, this looks clean, this looks crazy. This looks clean, this looks crazy. So we've got this beautiful, simple shape, and we've got this crazy, crazy shape that's been wonderfully simplified with the addition of this pink circle. So it's a really fun play with balance. Asymmetrical balance by color. So yellow is more eye-catching than this very neutral blue, or beautiful blue, but very neutralized on this black background. Here again, bigger area of green. If we're going by scale, this would be the heaviest thing, but the brightness and the shape of these guys brings our eye over here. We just swing right back. Nobody cares about this type. This is the most important stuff, drawing us forward into the magazine. Random balance. This is when everything's a little bit crazy. Oh, here we go. Very nice. Sex Pistols, right? Everything is a little chaotic. Can I divide this vertically and have the weight be the same, or horizontally have the weight be the same? Yes and no, and maybe even diagonally. It just is kind of crazy, but nothing is weighted over the other. Maybe here, but that might be because I know it's, a favorite of mine. However, it's just using this sort of chaotic feel to really not emphasize anything and therefore balance everything. Mathematical balance. This is the grid. We talked about using the grid. Examples of the grid. Very, very, very traditional take on graphic design. As a matter of fact, this guy down here, Moholy Nagy, is a very, very important artist in the history of design. And he's using a grid. So if you envision a grid on top of this, you can actually see where he chooses to divide everything, where he chooses to include everything. It's all organized very mathematically. The size of this, the size of this, it should all be in perfect proportion. Okay. Whew. Next one, rhythm. Rhythm, and again, this should be a review. You should have already done this reading and organizing a little bit, done your writing and your notes. I want you to see it and feel it as we go through here. And feeling is really important when it comes to rhythm. So legato and staccato are musical terms. They're Italian. Legato means long, so long, curving notes. Staccato is really rapid, like tap, 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 right? Really rough rhythm. And then alternating and progressive we'll take a look at. So legato rhythm, again, here's these long lines. It's a repetition. We've got repetition happening. We've got this long, 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 long feel of it. It feels legato or long. Milton Glaser, another really important artist here, using legato rhythm here. Repetition. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. Swirls. So here's staccato, repeated over and over again. Tap, 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 tap. Different sizes, but the repetition and the rhythm are what make it unified, balanced, and harmonious, right? Here we go. Poster, repetition, using that staccato rhythm. So very different than the legato. This feels much rougher. You can I hope understand the idea of the sound of this, especially I chose music posters for that. Alternating rhythm, big, small, big, small, big, small, big, small. We get where this pattern is going. It has a definite visual rhythm. Here again, so this is kind of a chaotic one, but we've got small, big, small, big, small, big. So even though the color is transitioning, this big spaces between each one of the letters, we understand this idea of alternating rhythm. Progressive rhythm. So this has a lot of directionality to it. Large to small, we're moving towards something with shapes that are very, very similar. We understand that visual progression. Here we go. Bop, ba-da, ba-da. Right. A, B, and C, visual rhythm, and their heights as well. Okay. If it's not out there, it's in here. It's kind of funny, right? Most of you guys have probably been born after 1992. Do they even make the yellow pages anymore? Okay, so depth. So where things are located, their size, their overlap, their atmosphere, perspective, and shadow. This will become important when we do cartooning. Depth by size. Which one is closest and which ones are farther away? So the largest items are closer to us. Important philosophy of the artist Cézanne. Large items, and they feel like they go back into space as they get smaller. So even here, we're not using true perspective. It's tried to be emphasized here by the artist, but it's not really perspective. It has surrealist elements, but we understand that this sculpture is closer to us than this one because of scale. Depth by overlapping. So which one is going to be closer to us? Is anything actually farther or closer away? No, it's on the computer screen, right? It's just an illusion. It's the creation of depth by where you locate things. So this one is in the back and these guys are in the front, right? Feels like this is on top of this one. Truthfully, this is just a broken L shape, and this is a broken square, and this is a complete square. Nothing is actually physically closer to me on the screen, but it feels like this guy is on top. Okay, that's with overlapping. Here we go. So here's a beautiful example of overlapping. I love the way these guys are intertwined. Very fascinating. Easy peasy to do with Photoshop now in Illustrator, especially in 1990, or what does it say, 1986? Oh, 1988, yeah. So it was created in 1986. This would have been a pain in the behind to put together. And now, when we do it with Illustrator, it's so fast. I'll show you how to build this. Really beautiful example. Atmospheric depth. So this is using color and tone, specifically tinting something, and shade, tint and shade, which we'll discuss when we talk about color. Should have looked at it a little bit already when we talked about the elements. So we've got lightest thing on top and the darker things recede into the background. We've got overlapping happening here as well, which is overemphasizing it. But we've got this bright one and the dark one. Brighter things come forward. Okay, so making things recede into the background, so the more intense stuff is coming forward. Atmosphere is created to make these guys feel farther away. Fantastic. This is for Band of Brothers, by the way. Fantastic show. Depth by perspective. Fantastic example of this one is the Star Wars opening sequence. Hopefully everybody's seen that as well. Here's a book cover. Creating perspective. So non-traditional use of perspective. We think of perspective when we think of like drawing of landscapes and cities. Here it is on a book cover, trying to create this action to emphasize faster, the acceleration of just about everything. So how can we make that more powerful using these techniques, using these principles? Depth with shadow, so creating form versus shape, balancing those two ideas. Here we go, creation of form. This edge is deeper and farther away from us than here. So playing with depth and creating puzzles. Puzzles can add visual interest, so things that are awkward and strange, just like the weird, strange shape when we talked about balance. If they're going to draw our eye, we're going to keep looking at it going, huh, that looks weird. And this is all about how I can control my viewer, how I can compose what they're looking at and what becomes important to them. All right, guys, so thank you so much. It's a lot of fun. I hope you got a better idea of the design principles.